I bet you haven't laid awake at night wondering what keeps a zoo biologist up at night. But I'm going to share with you 3 quandaries that are making us lose sleep right now because we'll all bear witness to them as our planet's story unfolds. Whether you're a zoo and aquarium visitor or not, you too will be affected by these questions because they impact how we decide what species we're going to save and what we're willing to do to save them. Accredited zoos have identified 4 objectives as part of their mission: conservation, education, research, and recreation. These are just some examples of the kinds of things we do. In the middle there, here at the St. Louis Zoo, we breed and reintroduce the endangered American burying beetle and the hellbender, which is an aquatic salamander, right here in Missouri. Visitors at our zoo have the opportunity to have an up-close encounter with seals and sea lions while being hundreds of miles away from an ocean. Visitors at the Cologne Zoo in Germany up here get to experience how much force it takes a giraffe's heart to pump blood all the way up to its head. Zoos have been making concerted efforts to deliver on these objectives for decades. We're going to spend a few minutes here at the beginning talking about how we're doing. The global zoo and aquarium community puts $350 million a year into field conservation, making us number 3 in the world in terms of conservation spending behind the Nature Conservancy and the World Wildlife Fund, who each put in about $400 million. We're heavily involved in reintroduction programs because we have captive breeding expertise. And we support thousands of different conservation initiatives that we either run ourselves or that we partner with other groups on. As an example, the reintroduction of the scimitar horned oryx here on the right. Zoos, including the St. Louis Zoo, have been working for nearly 20 years to return this species to the wild in northern Africa. And we finally were successful in doing that last year in the summer when we put the first animals back into the wild in Chad. Zoos also do a lot of wildlife advocacy work at the local, regional, and international level. The 96 Elephants campaign is a zoo-based campaign aimed at raising awareness of the fact that 96 elephants are killed every day in Africa for their ivory. This campaign has led to a number of laws at the federal and state level banning the sale of ivory in different parts of the U.S. We also do conservation at our sites, our institutions, in terms of efforts to promote water and energy conservation, to recycle and compost, eliminate the use of plastic bags, and we incorporate green building designs when we're building new buildings. We harness tremendous opportunities for education, both informal and formal. Informal education refers to interpretive graphics, chatting with a keeper or a volunteer, seeing an animal demonstration. But our formal education programs span the continuum from running accredited preschools at zoos, which the St. Louis Zoo runs one, all the way to distance learning, teacher training, and adult certificate programs. Research shows that our education programs improve scientific literacy and raise awareness and empathy. New studies are also showing that these education programs cause environmental action by citizens. We study the biology of a vast array of species in zoos and in the wild in order to support welfare and to generate new knowledge. We have hundreds of collaborations with universities and non-government organizations on projects. And one thing you might not realize is we fulfill hundreds of requests from researchers around the world for biomaterials, whether it's urine, feces, blood, or other kinds of tissue that we can either collect non-invasively from the animals or from their bodies when they die. Just some examples of our research. On the left, U.S. zoos worked with the forestry department in China to put satellite collars on the endangered takin antelope to help us understand the migration patterns. At the St. Louis Zoo, we study wildlife endocrinology to understand reproductive patterns and to understand how species respond to environmental challenges. When I was at the Bronx Zoo, we collected growth and development data on 43 African wild dog puppies born there and assessed different rabies and distemper vaccines for them, all studies that we couldn't do in the wild. Finally, as places for recreation, we see over 170 million visitors a year at U.S. zoos, 140 million in Europe. And that's more than all major sporting events combined. And when we study zoo visitors and ask them why zoos are important to them, they say they're important places for family time, time with friends, time to be with nature and for solitary reflection. We also know that when zoo visitors see well cared for animals, they experience positive emotions. And this is salient for us because positive affect promotes learning and fact retention. It also correlates with intentions to engage in conservation. All of this is obviously only possible with a well cared for and managed collection of animals. And so our first quandary is what mixture of species best delivers on these four objectives? We don't know the answer to that yet. Oh, the titles are all gone, just since yesterday. So, great. So how many crowd pleaser species should we have? How much emphasis should we place on endangered species or local species? We don't know the answer to this yet. And when you get down to deciding which species to work with, the decisions are very nuanced and difficult. Why is that? Well, it's difficult because we have limited space and resources. There's only so many zoos and aquariums. It's estimated that if you took all the animal space in the world's zoos and put it all in one place, that area is only a little bit larger than the city of St. Louis. And zoo-based conservationists are passionate about wildlife, and it feels morally wrong to us to not lend a hand to a species in need. It feels counter to our mission. But often practical realities dictate that we must make hard decisions like this. The ark is full right now. We're managing about 750,000 individuals of 6,000 different species in North American zoos. Here's some examples of the difficult decisions. Our North American bear species, the brown bear and black bear there on the left, are found in comparatively large numbers. So there isn't a pressing need to raise awareness of their existence or their biology. In some places, they're even hunted. But they are on the front lines of human-animal conflict in North America, and the black bear is endemic to North America. So the North American bears get points for being big, charismatic animals, and they give us the ability to tell local wildlife stories. Zoo biologists and the public also love feel-good stories when a zoo is able to provide a home for bear cubs that have been orphaned in the wild. But neither of those species is threatened with extinction. In contrast, several of the Asian bear species, like the giant panda and the sun bear, as well as the Andean bear on the bottom from South America, only exist now in drastically reduced numbers and face significant pressure in the wild, warranting a lot of conservation attention. Only the giant panda among those has significant charisma and recognition attached to it, and they're rare as well. So should we phase North American bears out of US zoos, which means no longer telling the local wildlife story of bears, and no longer taking in cubs that are orphaned in the wild, in order to make space for the more endangered bear species from other parts of the world? The public has always had more awareness of and concern for the large charismatic fauna compared to the ones on the right. The large charismatic fauna, though, have always been less diverse in terms of numbers of species and lower in absolute numbers, but they're more likely to be endangered. Obviously, there's exceptions. The rusty-sided bumblebee was proposed to be listed as endangered just last year. Should we be doing more work to inspire care about these less charismatic species that are still more abundant? Because in many cases, they are near the base of the food chain and may be more ecologically important. Should we be working with and doing more education programs related to bees and other pollinators because they're critical for our food supply? These less charismatic species are the bulk of biodiversity. There's many more of them. So to do justice to them, should we be working with a lot more species of them? Should we have zoos that are only devoted to reptiles and amphibians, or just to insects? Would zoos like that be economically viable? Would visitors come to those? So our first big quandary is how to allocate space on the current ark. Our second quandary relates to climate change, which is a threat to biodiversity like no other. Excuse me. With habitat loss due to deforestation or development, or with poaching, one could imagine actions you could take to reverse or slow down those trends. Large national parks could be created, land reforested, reserves could be better patrolled for poaching, and wildlife law better enforced. Climate change doesn't fit this bill, though. With climate change, the habitat is permanently altered. The dynamics of the ocean are permanently changed. Even if all carbon emissions ceased immediately, which is impossible, our planet would continue to warm for at least another 40 years. We would continue to lose more ice. Our climate would continue to change. Eventually, the temperature on the planet can stabilize, but it'll be thousands of years before the excess carbon in the atmosphere now has a chance to be reabsorbed, giving the planet a chance to cool. So our big ethical question is, which species, whether they're in zoos or in the wild, do we help get through climate change? When the polar ice cap has become so reduced that the polar bear can no longer travel the distances it must to find enough food, do we let them go extinct? Before that happens, do we capture a large group of them and bring them into specially designed habitats just so that we preserve the essence of polar bear on the planet? Or do we provision the last wild polar bears with food so that they can stay out in their natural habitat? Do we watch them struggle to become something different? Will natural selection show us the dawn of the northern latitudes bear, whose most recent ancestor is the now extinct polar bear? We would have to ask questions like this for all the species on this slide and many others which are going to be affected by climate change. We estimate as many as 18,000 animal species will go extinct due to climate change. Excuse me. And so if we decide to take some animals, some more species onto the ark, who will we kick off the ark? Will a large influx of polar bears displace the Andean bear? Or will they displace lions, who are also on the decline? And if we bring them there, how long should we plan to keep them there? How long should we wait to see if the El Niño patterns return to the ocean, giving us a clue that it would be safe to reintroduce sea otters? And if we had a sense that those old patterns or those old places would never return, would we still bring animals into captivity in order to preserve them? How much do we value preventing the outright extinction of a species by preserving it in a zoo or a large fenced reserve versus letting them remain free-ranging, even if that scenario may no longer exist, because there's no wilderness left that's not touched by humans? How much support would we give to those species that are trying to adapt? If the wetlands that the whooping crane depends on in North America disappear, would we move them to other continents where there are wetlands? Would we do the same thing for North American caribou? Would we move them to Scandinavia where they might intermingle with reindeer? Our last quandary relates to the fact that evolution has bestowed every living organism with a high reproductive drive, and the expansion of the human footprint has often conflicted with this drive. In places where we've nearly exterminated large predators, as we have here in North America, some species like white-tailed deer have become superabundant, and they cause significant damage to the landscape and to other species. And so we resorted to lethal control of white-tailed deer to suppress their population growth. African elephants and American black bears have pursued their reproductive drive in ever smaller human-dominated landscapes. They frequently come into conflict with humans, and elephants can be particularly destructive to their environment if their movements are restricted. Both of these species have nowhere to go and essentially no safe way to get there. And so in some cases, their populations also are controlled with lethal control. We sometimes employ lethal control on one species to help another one rebound. For example, in California, seagulls and ravens are shot to allow the snowy plover to recover. Why would a zoo biologist think about this? Well, we too manage species with high reproductive drive in limited space, whose populations could easily outstrip their resources if we couldn't manage them. There are contraceptives, but the options are limited. There's not a large enough market for otter contraceptives for any pharmaceutical company to invest the money in developing an array of safe, effective, reversible otter contraceptives. And we can't often borrow products from the pet market because US pet owners don't contracept their pets. They sterilize them. And that's not what we want to do in zoos, where we're trying to help populations persist over time. We're also learning that for some species, like the African painted dog here, just separating the boys from the girls can have detrimental effects on health. Some species have trouble resuming reproduction if you interrupt it, or they experience reproductive pathology. Might we too have to consider culling in some cases so that these species could breed often enough to maintain their reproductive function? And if we refuse to consider that, what are the ramifications of preventing these animals from engaging in what is probably the most highly motivated behavior that they have, mating? Again, the ark is full, and we don't expect a lot of new arks to be built in the near future. The massive need for global conservation efforts right now is a direct result of the human influence. It is essentially our fault. But the human capacity for empathy endears us to wildlife and encourages us to try to become part of the solution rather than the problem. And doing conservation makes us feel good. But the lesson for you today is that conservation will increasingly demand that you become uncomfortable. We'll face difficult decisions about the plight of species in the wild and in zoos, which species to assist and which ones to simply wish good luck to. We'll face difficult decisions about individuals versus populations. And we'll be given uncomfortable options that we have to choose among in order to help animals persist. I believe our ethical mandate is to put all of our human discomfort aside and do whatever it takes to help those populations persist, so that we are a part of the solution rather than the problem. How we do all of that is what keeps me up at night. Thank you.
All right, everyone. That's our TEDx St. Louis University event. Thank you all for coming out. I just real quick want to give a shout out to the team that worked on this. Angad Ravanam, Delaney Palmer, Burju Patel. Would you guys stand up and just give a little wave real quick? They've helped me out. I've helped them out. Burju's the leader producer. He's in charge of it all. But they've been helping tremendously. We've got some people who have unfortunately had to leave to go to prior engagements. Sam Krankovich and Kevin Toner as well. So big shout out to them. And a big shout out to all of our speakers that we've had today. We've covered a lot of different topics. And I want to encourage everyone that's here to think about those topics and discuss them. One of the big things that TED says, their tagline, is ideas worth spreading, all right? We can be in here and we can hear these ideas, but that's not what TED's about. TED's about spreading those ideas. So I encourage all of you, please go home, talk to your friends, share stuff on Facebook, start conversations with people, and talk about some of the ideas that you've heard today. We've heard a bunch, and a bunch of very different ones. So there should be a lot of conversations going on. And I just want to say thank you all for coming out one more time. Thank you for the speakers. Thank you for Iron Man for running the lights and the sound. And thank you for St. Louis University and TEDx for letting us host this event and organize it. Thank you all.